what happens in the subsequent two paintings is we begin to see these very same buildings falling into ruin. But once again, this idea of piling up one architectural motif on another, all of them taken from books, is something that painters were using as well as architects. And here we see what William Strickland did with the same idea for the Tennessee State Capitol. You see he used an Ionic portico here, octa style, that doesn't have any particular antecedent to it, but he used the Lysicrates perched right on the top, as though it were something out of Thomas Cole's painting. But the details of the Lysicrates monument are right there. And you can see it's actually a very close copy. And in fact, William Strickland did this in two other buildings in Philadelphia and Maine as well. So it became something that is one of the progenies of Stuart and Rivette and the Lysicrates monument itself. Now, this was not the first time, of course, that classicism was of interest in the United States, and I really have to tell you a little bit about Thomas Jefferson. You see him here. He loved architecture. He was an architect himself, and he had the good fortune to go to France, but he only got as far as close to Italy as the Maison Calais in southern France. And he tells us in a preserved letter that he spent hours looking at it like a sighing lover, just gazing at this building. So this Roman Augustan temple was the closest that he ever got to anything that was authentically ancient. But he did own a copy of Stuart and Rivette. And so those drawings were instrumental in his building of Monticello and also for the University of Virginia Rotunda as well. The only antiquity he had was a copy of what they thought was a sleeping Ariadne that you see here that's now in the Vatican Museum. Another early American who was very much a Philhellene was Nicholas Biddle. And Nicholas Biddle, who eventually became the president of the Bank of the United States, came to Greece when he was a young man in 1806, and he was one of the first Americans that we know of to come here. So not British, but American. Fortunately, we have his diary and journal preserved. We have a copy of it, a publication of it in the Gennadian Library, and it makes for very interesting reading. The Ottoman Turks didn't really quite know what to do about Americans. After all, it was such a new country at the time. They weren't quite as hostile to them as they were to French and to British at the time. Nicholas Biddle himself was very, very interested in classics. In fact, he enrolled in the University of Pennsylvania when he was 10 years old. He was a genius. And they refused to give him a degree, so he transferred to Princeton. So he's actually a graduate of Princeton, class of 1801. And then he had his trip to Greece and absolutely fell in love with Athens. And so when he was in a position of power to commission a new bank building to be built in Philadelphia, he hired William Strickland, who at the time was not sticking Lysicrates monuments on top of everything, but now was looking for a more austere facade, something that would evoke the Parthenon. So we actually have fairly accurate columns here, and it's pretty clear that Strickland was relying on books like Stuart's and Rivette's for a fairly accurate rendition of a Doric facade here for the bank building, which is now a landmark because, of course, there is no longer any Bank of the United States. But in Philadelphia, the building is still there. So I would just like to conclude with some reflections about the impact of Stuart and Rivette. I show you here two engraved drawings of them as they were in their much older years. It seems as though the rest of their story is a little bit sadder. I've often speculated about what kinds of conditions they must have encountered in 1751. Where did they stay? Where did they live? What was it like to be here? Did they have to deal with bed bugs? As we know that people did traveling with the American school in the early 20th century, and people still do if you go to New York. So what were there? How did they get along with each other? Because although they had a shared interest in architecture, they actually were from rather different backgrounds. It seems from all that I can read about this that Athenian Stuart was rather better liked by people, but at the same time, he was regarded as somewhat lazy and dilatory. In fact, it was his fault primarily that it took so long for them to publish their book, and that's why they were scooped by Leroy. Nicholas Rivette, for example, did build some things in his own name, but he never got quite the publicity and attention that Athenian Stuart did. And so you have the feeling that he might have died a more disappointed man. He lived a little bit longer, however, because Athenian Stuart was rather bibulous. He fit well into the society of the dilettanti because he really did like his drink. But together, what they did between 51 and 53 was really, really important for us, because not only did they document what these buildings looked like at a particular point in time, but they pointed forward to the kinds of techniques that we could use to study them even today. And at times, when I'm undertaking this kind of work myself, of measuring and drawing blocks, I feel a little bitter that the field doesn't seem to have moved very much in 260 years. That is, why am I still doing the same sorts of things that Stuart and Rivette did? But we still need to do that kind of work. There are whole temples that have never been measured and drawn. So we, in fact, haven't moved beyond them. I would say that of recent work, we could say that the style of Stuart and Rivette is perhaps best encapsulated by the wonderful work that Manolis Korres has done. And I just single out, because he makes many wonderful drawings, I single out his discovery of windows in the Parthenon, which required detailed knowledge of broken blocks and how they should be put together. Also, not yet in this drawing is the interior staircase that Korres discovered in the interstice of the wall here. And this kind of drawing that gives you a sense of what this particular part of the building would look like in an analytical way. What's of profound importance, too, is the recognition that the frieze of the Parthenon could well have continued in the inside of the pronaos, which would cause complete reevaluation of the content of the frieze of the Parthenon, if that's correct. Remember, in the discussions about them, people complain about where's the Panathenaic ship, if this really represents the Panathenaic procession, where is such and such, where is such and such? Well, if it represents the Panathenaic procession, and if the frieze really does continue here, there could have been much more space for figures here. So Korres's work combines the best, I would say, of Stuart and Rivette, of accurate representation, of archaeological deduction, and to some extent speculation as well that leads further into new thoughts and new discoveries about things. Now ultimately, and this is a little bit faded out here, I'm afraid, it's a little bit dark for the screen, but ultimately it's computer reconstruction where we could really move forward. So here, taking Korres's windows, here in this computer model, you could see the sunlight coming into the interior of the Parthenon, coming across the pool, and lit not only by the doorway, but also by the windows as well. Now, what's missing in this design, of course, is more of the context of the temple. So what I would like to see, if this could be altered, I would like to see some tapestries, some paintings. I would like to see shelves with dedications, because we have inscriptions preserved that tell us what treasures there were in the Parthenon. And in fact, I think the entire building was stuffed like an old attic or like a very crowded museum with votive offerings of all sorts. So this is rather too tidy for my taste, but from an architectural point of view, it's clean and showing you how the lines go, as long as you don't mind the fisheye look.